The courtroom was buzzing with tension. The air felt thick with anticipation, each person waiting for the moment when the judge would call the case. It was a high-profile trial, one that had drawn attention from local news outlets and legal experts. The gallery was full, with reporters scribbling notes and the audience murmuring about the case. It was an affair of the highest importance, a business tycoon accused of embezzling millions from his own company. No one expected the defendant to be a teenager. Ethan Walker, a 16-year-old high school student, sat nervously at the defendant's table. He was small for his age, with tousled brown hair that always looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, and eyes that seemed a little too wide, like he was trying to take in the whole world at once. Wearing a wrinkled suit he'd borrowed from his mother's closet, he looked completely out of place in the stiff, polished courtroom. He didn't belong here, or at least, that's what the people around him seemed to think. Judge Clarkson, a man known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, peered down at Ethan with raised eyebrows. He flipped through the files in front of him, clearly confused. His gaze shifted between the teenager and the legal team on both sides of the courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Allison Blake, looked at Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amusement. She had seen many defendants over the years, but this was something new. "Mr. Walker?" Judge Clarkson asked, his voice booming in the quiet room. "You're the defendant?" Ethan straightened up in his chair, his heart racing. This was it, the moment where everyone realized he wasn't some joke. That he wasn't out of his depth. He was ready. Or at least, he thought he was. He cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan replied, his voice more confident than he felt. The judge glanced at the documents in front of him again, then back at Ethan. He couldn't help but chuckle, a dry, dismissive sound that echoed through the courtroom. "Well, this is a first," Judge Clarkson muttered, barely audible but enough for everyone to hear. A teenager accused of embezzling millions, a child defending himself in a courtroom. A ripple of laughter passed through the courtroom. Ethan felt the weight of every eye on him. He knew they didn't take him seriously. Who could blame them? A teenager who spent most of his time in high school, who had never seen the inside of a law office except on TV. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that Ethan had been studying the law for years. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. His father was the accused, and no one, not the prosecutors, not the defense lawyers, had done enough to clear his name. Ethan had spent nights reading legal textbooks, poring over old court cases, studying the patterns of the law like it was some kind of puzzle he was determined to solve. Ethan had read every document related to his father's case. He knew the charges. He knew the evidence. He knew the loopholes. And most importantly, he knew what they were missing. This wasn't just a simple courtroom drama. This was his father's future at stake, and Ethan wasn't about to let him go down without a fight. The judge cleared his throat, still eyeing Ethan like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "All right then," Judge Clarkson said, his voice more serious now, but still tinged with disbelief. "Mr. Walker, you may proceed with your defense." A few chuckles echoed around the room, but they quickly died down as Ethan stood up. He straightened his borrowed suit jacket and took a deep breath. It was time to prove them all wrong. As he walked toward the podium, he could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on him, the weight of their doubt pressing down like a heavy blanket. He knew they were all wondering the same thing: what was a kid like him going to do in a situation like this? How could he possibly have any idea what he was doing? Ethan set his notes on the podium, trying to steady his trembling hands. He wasn't just standing in front of a judge and a jury. He was standing up for his father. He was standing up for his family. He glanced at the prosecutor, Allison Blake, who was now leaning back in her chair, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She didn't think Ethan could do it. He could see it in the way she rolled her eyes when he spoke, in the way she barely paid attention to his words. But Ethan wasn't fazed. He'd read every legal brief he could get his hands on. He'd watched every courtroom drama, every trial that had ever been televised. He knew the rules, the procedures, and the strategies. He might have been young, but his mind was sharp, and he wasn't afraid to put it to work. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice gaining strength with every word. "The case you are hearing today is about more than just the charges against my father. It's about truth. It's about uncovering what really happened here." He paused, looking around the courtroom. He could feel the tension. They were listening now. At least, they were pretending to. Every piece of evidence that's been presented to this point has been carefully selected to fit a narrative. But I'm here to tell you that the narrative is wrong. Ethan's voice was firm. "My father didn't steal. He didn't embezzle. The evidence you've seen has been manipulated to make it look that way. I'm here to show you what's really going on." The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The prosecutor, however, was now leaning forward, her interest piqued. She shot Ethan a look of disbelief, but there was something else there too, a hint of curiosity. Was this just a fluke, or did this teenager actually know something? Ethan continued, his mind working like a well-oiled machine. "The person responsible for this, whoever they are, has carefully hidden their tracks. But the truth is there. It's all in the details, Your Honor. I'll prove it." The courtroom fell silent as Ethan laid out his first piece of evidence, a small detail buried in the financial records that had been overlooked by the prosecution. It was a discrepancy so small that no one had caught it. But to Ethan, it was the key to everything. For the first time since the trial began, the judge stopped writing notes. He looked up at Ethan with an expression that was no longer one of amusement, but one of mild interest. "Is that so, Mr. Walker?" Judge Clarkson asked, his voice much softer now. "You seem to know a lot about these records." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This was just the beginning. He had them right where he wanted them. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, but Ethan knew something they didn't. He wasn't just some kid who had gotten lucky. He was a kid who had studied the law like his life depended on it, and maybe, just maybe, it did. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ethan Walker didn't look like a typical defendant. He didn't walk with the swagger of a hardened criminal or even the nervous gait of someone who'd found themselves in over their head. Instead, Ethan was a kid who, up until a few weeks ago, had been doing what most teenagers do. He went to high school, played video games, hung out with friends, and, occasionally, helped his mom with chores around the house. But if you took a closer look, you'd see a boy who wasn't quite like the others. While his classmates spent their weekends playing football or catching up on the latest movies, Ethan spent hours in his room, hunched over his desk with his head buried in books about law, courtroom procedures, and criminal justice. He wasn't just passively learning. He was obsessed. His obsession wasn't because he had dreams of being a lawyer, it was because, in his world, the law was the one thing that could make sense of everything. It had all started when Ethan was just 10 years old. His father, Greg Walker, had been a rising star in the world of business. Greg was known for his sharp mind and even sharper instincts when it came to making money. But all that changed when he was accused of a financial crime, embezzling funds from his own company. The charges were serious, and they were backed by a trail of damning evidence. The media quickly painted him as a villain, and the case became a high-profile spectacle. It was a nightmare for Ethan's family. Ethan was only a child, but he could sense the heavy cloud of shame that hung over their household. He could feel the way his mother, Clara, would try to hide her tears when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw how his father's friends and business associates distanced themselves, offering only the most perfunctory words of support. Ethan hated it. He hated feeling powerless. He hated seeing his father, a man who had once seemed invincible, reduced to someone whose word meant nothing in the eyes of the world. But more than anything, Ethan hated the feeling that no one was truly fighting for his father. The attorneys, the police, and even the press, they all seemed focused on one thing, making his father's guilt seem inevitable. No one seemed to care whether Greg Walker was truly guilty or if there was more to the story. That's when Ethan made a decision. He would find out the truth. He would figure out what happened to his father. And to do that, he needed to learn everything about the law. He needed to understand how the justice system worked, and, more importantly, how it could be manipulated. His father's innocence depended on it. As Ethan grew older, his passion for law grew too. He would read legal textbooks late into the night, teaching himself about criminal law, contracts, and court procedures. He spent hours on online forums discussing legal cases with strangers who were much older and more experienced than him. It was a lonely existence, but it was also his escape. While his peers were chasing fleeting teenage pleasures, Ethan was studying legal documents, piecing together old court cases, and analyzing how the law could be used to either protect or destroy people. At school, Ethan's obsession with the law made him an outcast. He didn't fit in with the popular kids or the jocks. He didn't have much in common with the kids who liked to hang out at the mall or go to parties. But he didn't mind. As long as he had his books, his research, and his mission, that was enough. His best friend, Luke, was one of the few people who tried to understand. Luke had always been there for Ethan, even if he didn't quite grasp what Ethan was going through. He was a good friend, a loyal one, but he didn't see the world through the same lens as Ethan did. Luke cared more about his guitar and football than about studying courtroom dramas or figuring out loopholes in legal statutes. "You're really gonna be a lawyer, huh?" Luke had asked one afternoon, as they sat on the porch of Ethan's house, eating pizza. The two of them were 15 at the time. Ethan had just finished reading a lengthy Supreme Court case and was explaining its relevance to his father's case. "Maybe," Ethan had replied, his eyes still glued to the text in front of him. "I mean, I have to help Dad. This stuff matters. I need to figure out what went wrong." Luke had rolled his eyes, taking a bite of his pizza. "Man, you're obsessed with this stuff. You need to take a break. Go out and live a little." Ethan hadn't looked up from his book. "I am living. This is my life now." But there was something else, something more personal that drove Ethan. While he studied the law, he had also been learning about himself. About the person he wanted to be. His father, Greg Walker, had always been his hero. Ethan had idolized him as a young boy, believing that nothing could break his father's spirit. But as the trial dragged on and the accusations against Greg seemed to mount, Ethan's idolization turned into something else, something deeper. He wasn't just learning the law for the sake of learning it. He was learning it so he could save his father. It was late one night, about a month before the trial began, when Ethan discovered something that would change everything. He was combing through financial records from his father's company when he found a small discrepancy. It was nothing huge, just a number in the company's balance sheet that didn't quite match up with the others. But something about it didn't sit right with him. Ethan stared at the numbers for a long time, his mind racing. It was a small mistake, yes, but it was a mistake that someone with ill intentions could easily manipulate. The more he dug, the more he uncovered. His father's company wasn't just being accused of embezzling funds, it was being framed. He didn't tell anyone about his discovery, not even Luke. This was something Ethan had to figure out on his own. If he was right, this could be the breakthrough his father needed to clear his name. But there was only one problem: he didn't have the legal authority to do anything with this information. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't even an adult. He was just a kid, fighting against a system that seemed determined to make his father guilty. But he couldn't give up. Ethan had spent so many nights studying, pushing himself further and further into the world of law. He was ready to prove that a teenager, a kid who had no business being in a courtroom, could make a difference. And so, when the trial came around, when his father was brought into the courtroom to face charges he didn't deserve, Ethan didn't sit in the back and stay quiet. He didn't hide behind the shadows. Instead, he did what he'd been preparing for all his life: he stood up. Ethan might have been an underdog, but that didn't matter anymore. He had something that none of the others had: a sharp mind, an unyielding will, and a mission to uncover the truth. The courtroom had underestimated him. But it wouldn't for long. Ethan sat back down at the defendant's table, his heart still racing from his opening statement. He had never spoken in front of so many people before, and yet, there was a strange sense of calm that settled over him now. It was as if the moment he had been preparing for all these years had finally arrived. This wasn't just about his father anymore, it was about proving something bigger. Ethan wasn't just defending a man in the eyes of the court, he was defending the very idea of justice itself. The prosecutor, Allison Blake, had raised her eyebrows as Ethan made his case. She had, for a brief moment, stopped smirking and leaned forward, eyes narrowing as though searching for the trick behind the teenage defendant's words. But after Ethan's unexpected challenge, she quickly regained her composure, ready to retaliate. "Your Honor," Blake began, standing tall at her podium. "I'll admit, we've seen some unusual cases in this courtroom, but this," she motioned to Ethan with a dramatic flair, "is a new one." The gallery snickered, and even the judge seemed to struggle to suppress a smile. It was clear no one was taking Ethan seriously. But Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected this. The world was a big place, and people would laugh at you, mock you, and dismiss you. But what they didn't know was that Ethan was more than just a teenager. He was a problem solver. And problems were made to be solved. Blake continued, her voice cutting through the air, "Mr. Walker claims his father is innocent, but let's look at the facts. Mr. Greg Walker, the defendant's father, has been the head of a corporation for over 15 years. He was in charge of millions of dollars. And he's the one that signed the checks, the ones that disappeared." She pointed to the big screen, where an image of the financial records was projected for everyone to see. Ethan could feel the heat rising in his chest. The numbers were right there, plain as day. The money was gone. But Ethan knew better. The truth was hidden behind those numbers, and it wasn't going to be revealed in the way they thought it would. "Your Honor," Ethan interrupted, standing tall once more. "I need to address this discrepancy." He pointed to a part of the document on the screen, highlighting the missing funds. "I don't deny that money is missing. But the question is, who's really responsible?" The prosecutor's smirk faltered for a second as she glanced at the judge, clearly caught off guard by Ethan's boldness. But she recovered quickly. "And just what are you suggesting, Mr. Walker?" she asked with a sneer. "That your father was framed? You really expect us to believe that?" Ethan steadied himself. He knew exactly what he was about to say, and now was the time to drop the bombshell. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice unwavering. "I do believe my father was framed. And I'm going to prove it." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge, who had been trying to suppress his amusement at the whole situation, now sat straighter in his seat. The audience was tense, and all eyes turned toward Ethan. "This case isn't as simple as it looks," Ethan continued. "The people who set up my father knew exactly what they were doing. They manipulated the records to make it look like he stole, but they left behind a trail. A trail that no one has followed, until now." Ethan paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. He could see the slight flicker of doubt in the prosecutor's eyes. But he knew he had to be careful, he couldn't let them think for a second that this was just some lucky guess. He needed proof. "I'm talking about a transfer," Ethan said. "A transfer that happened under the radar. A small, seemingly insignificant transaction that was made from my father's company account. But it wasn't my father who authorized it. It was someone else, someone close to him." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people whispered among themselves. Ethan could tell they were starting to take him seriously. It was a small victory, but it was enough. The judge leaned forward, his expression now one of curiosity. "Mr. Walker, are you telling this court that someone else authorized this transfer? Someone who's not your father?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor," Ethan replied, his voice filled with determination. "I've gone over the records, over and over again. And the signature on that transfer, it's not my father's. It's someone else's." Blake's face tightened, her confident demeanor slipping for just a moment. "You're making some very serious accusations, Mr. Walker," she said, her tone becoming colder. "And I'm sure you'll be able to provide evidence for this, forgery, as you call it?" Ethan didn't falter. "Yes. I will." He turned back to his table and pulled out a set of documents from his briefcase. The papers were filled with the detailed breakdowns of his father's company accounts, showing the traceable records of the transactions over the last several months. Ethan had found something crucial, a mismatch in the approval logs. The name on the transfer had been marked under a pseudonym, one that no one had noticed before. "Your Honor, if we look here," Ethan pointed to the documents he held, "you'll see that the transaction in question was authorized by someone who was using a fake name. A name that matches one used by a former employee of my father's company, someone who was dismissed months ago for embezzling funds." The courtroom was silent now, every person trying to grasp the enormity of what Ethan was suggesting. The prosecutor stood frozen, her earlier confidence shattered. Judge Clarkson adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Ethan with a look of both admiration and caution. "You've done your homework, Mr. Walker." Ethan nodded, trying to hide the pride swelling inside him. "I've had to." Blake's voice was tight. "Your Honor, we're supposed to be addressing the current case, not digging up old files that don't even belong here." Mr. Walker is grasping at straws. But Ethan wasn't done. "This isn't grasping at straws," he countered. "This is the truth. This is what happened. And I can prove it." For the first time, the judge's face became more serious. "Mr. Walker, if what you say is true, we may have an entirely new direction in this case." He paused, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "I'm granting a recess. We will reconvene after a brief break to examine these new claims." The courtroom buzzed with conversation as the judge rose from his seat and exited the room. The prosecutor remained seated, glaring at Ethan with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Ethan could feel the tension building, but he knew he had just crossed a significant threshold. The fight was on. Ethan could feel the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him as he waited for the judge to return. The brief recess had allowed the murmurs to settle, but the air was still thick with tension. His mind raced, but his exterior remained calm. This was only the beginning. The truth about his father's case wasn't going to be solved in a single afternoon. It would take more than just one breakthrough to undo the damage done. But this was a critical moment, one that could open the floodgates to a revelation that could clear his father's name. Ethan had no intention of backing down. He would see this through, no matter the odds. A few minutes later, Judge Clarkson re-entered the room, the gavel in hand. The murmur of the courtroom silenced immediately as the judge took his seat. "Mr. Walker," the judge said, looking directly at Ethan, "you've presented new evidence that warrants further investigation. I'm instructing both the defense and the prosecution to examine these claims thoroughly. For now, we'll proceed with the recess. I expect both parties to return with a more in-depth look at these documents." Ethan nodded respectfully, though his mind was already spinning. The next few hours would be crucial. If he could prove that someone inside his father's company had orchestrated the fraud, then his father could be freed. But if the prosecutor managed to discredit the evidence or twist the facts, it would be a huge setback. The recess was brief, just enough time for Ethan to feel the weight of what he had just done. As the lawyers began to huddle at the back of the courtroom, talking in low voices, Ethan's mother, Clara, walked over to him. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and pride. "Ethan," She began, her voice soft, "You really think you can prove this? You're just a kid." Ethan glanced at his mother, who was wringing her hands in worry. The same worry that had been with her ever since the charges against Greg had been leveled. But seeing her now, her concern only pushed him harder. "I'm not just a kid, Mom. I've spent my whole life learning this stuff. I know I can do it." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears she hadn't allowed to fall. "You've always been smart, but this is big, Ethan. This is huge. Are you sure you're ready for everything that's about to come?" Ethan took a deep breath. He didn't have the luxury of uncertainty. His father's freedom depended on him, and more importantly, his father's reputation. For years, Greg Walker had been demonized by the media, his name dragged through the mud. No one, including the law, was willing to consider the possibility of a mistake. But Ethan had discovered the truth, and he wasn't going to let anyone dismiss it. "I have to be," Ethan said, his voice steady. "For Dad. For us." Clara gave him a long, searching look, her eyes filled with love and fear. She pulled him into a tight hug. "Just, be careful," she whispered. "The world's a tough place, and you're dealing with people who don't play by the same rules." "I know," Ethan replied. "But I've got to try." The recess ended, and both the defense and prosecution returned to their places. The judge cleared his throat and called the court back to order. "As we reconvene, I'd like both parties to address the new evidence that Mr. Walker has presented." "The defense will begin," Judge Clarkson said. Ethan's lawyer, Mr. Nelson, a seasoned attorney who had been handling the case since the beginning, stood up and adjusted his glasses. He was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, one who had been largely skeptical of Ethan's involvement in the case up until now. But Ethan's recent revelation had shifted that view, and Mr. Nelson seemed to respect the young man's instincts. "Your Honor, we have reviewed the documents Mr. Walker has presented, and we find that they are legitimate," Mr. Nelson began. "The transaction in question appears to have been authorized by someone outside of Mr. Walker's knowledge, and the forged signature is consistent with the work of a former employee who was dismissed under suspicious circumstances." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding in anticipation. This was it, his first major victory in the courtroom. "However," Mr. Nelson continued, "we need further time to investigate this individual and determine their exact role in the alleged fraud. The prosecution's case, as it stands, is built on the assumption that Mr. Greg Walker knowingly embezzled funds. But if this new evidence holds up, then we may have to consider the possibility of a larger conspiracy." A murmur rippled through the courtroom again, and the prosecutor, Allison Blake, didn't look happy. She stood up sharply, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way to the front. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "The defense would like us to believe that this is all part of a larger conspiracy. But where's the proof? A name on a document and a forged signature don't make a case. They're merely distractions. The real evidence, Your Honor, points directly to Mr. Walker. The funds were transferred from his company account, under his authority, and that's all that matters." Blake's words felt like a slap to the face, but Ethan wasn't deterred. He had prepared for this moment. He had expected the prosecution to try to dismiss everything he'd found. But he also knew they wouldn't be able to dismiss the truth forever. "Your Honor," Ethan interjected, standing once again, "this is where you're wrong. This isn't just a name on a document. It's a person, and that person has a history. The funds didn't just disappear. They were siphoned out of my father's company by someone who had access to his accounts and wanted to frame him. And I can prove it." The prosecutor's face grew dark with irritation, but Ethan pressed on, undeterred. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He wasn't just some teenager playing at law. He was a force to be reckoned with. "If you want proof," Ethan said, his voice gaining strength, "then I'll give it to you. The person behind this fraud is someone you all overlooked. But I'll make sure you don't miss them anymore. The courtroom grew silent once more as Ethan's words hung in the air. The tension was palpable. Judge Clarkson looked at Ethan, then back at the prosecutor. "It seems we may have more to investigate, Ms. Blake. I'll give the defense time to prepare the next phase of their case. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning." Ethan sat back down, his pulse still racing. But for the first time since the trial began, he felt a surge of hope. He had uncovered the first piece of the puzzle, and now he was going to find out who was behind this scheme. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the courthouse early, as he had every day for the past week. But today felt different. There was a palpable shift in the air, a sense of urgency that filled the space. The judge had granted them a short recess, but the real work was only beginning. Ethan's mind raced as he prepared for what lay ahead. His discovery from yesterday was just the first domino in a chain that could unravel everything: the fraud, the embezzlement, the conspiracy against his father. But who was the mastermind behind it all? He had a hunch. There was one person, one figure who had always lurked in the shadows of his father's company, someone who was far too quiet, too subtle to be ignored. Ethan wasn't sure how to connect the dots yet, but he knew that person held the key. Ethan sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, his briefcase resting on his lap. His mom sat beside him, her face a mask of worry. But even in her anxious silence, Ethan could see a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was small, but it was there. She knew as well as he did that this case was the beginning of something bigger than either of them had anticipated. And Ethan wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. Clara reached over and squeezed his hand, offering him a small smile. "You're doing great, Ethan. Just stay calm. Keep pushing. You've got this." "Thanks, Mom," Ethan replied, though he felt far from calm. But he couldn't afford to falter. Not now. Not when the stakes were higher than ever. The doors to the courtroom opened, and Ethan stood quickly, straightening his jacket. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. As he entered the courtroom, he could feel the weight of everyone's gaze upon him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe. He had to focus. He had to stay one step ahead. Judge Clarkson called the room to order, his gavel hitting the wood with a sharp crack. "We're back in session. The defense has requested additional time to investigate the new evidence, and I expect the prosecution to review it thoroughly as well. Mr. Nelson, you may begin." Mr. Nelson stood up and adjusted his tie, his demeanor calm but serious. "Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence that my client has presented, it's clear that we are dealing with something much more complicated than originally believed. We're not just talking about a few misplaced transactions or sloppy bookkeeping. We're talking about a deliberate effort to frame Mr. Greg Walker for a crime he didn't commit." The prosecutor, Allison Blake, immediately rose to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor," she interjected, her voice sharp and biting. "The defense is attempting to distract the court from the real issue here. Mr. Walker's signature is on these documents. It's his company, his responsibility. The idea that he's been framed by an unknown person is pure speculation." Ethan's stomach churned as he heard the familiar refrain. But he couldn't back down. This wasn't just speculation. This was the truth, and he was going to prove it. "Your Honor," Ethan spoke up, rising to his feet before Mr. Nelson could respond. His voice rang clear and steady, carrying the weight of his resolve. "I have the name. The name of the person who authorized those fraudulent transfers." A wave of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Blake's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You have a name?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Yes. And I've already begun investigating that individual. Their connection to my father's company is undeniable. The signature we saw on those transactions doesn't belong to my father. It belongs to someone who had access to the accounts long after they were supposed to have been removed. I'm talking about someone very close to the center of this case. The judge raised his eyebrows. Mr. Walker, do you have any evidence to support this claim? I do, Ethan said, pulling out a folder from his briefcase. He walked over to the judge's bench and handed the folder to the court clerk. The person I'm referring to is Victor Ross. He was a senior financial analyst at my father's company. He was dismissed months ago for poor performance, but he retained access to the company's internal systems due to his previous position. I believe he's the one who authorized those transfers, and I have evidence to prove it. The room fell silent. Ethan could hear the shuffle of papers as the judge flipped through the folder. The prosecutor's expression was frozen, her lips tight as she glared at Ethan. Victor Ross? Blake finally spoke, her voice tinged with disbelief. That's a bold accusation, Mr. Walker. But can you explain why Ross would risk his career, his entire future, to frame your father? Ethan turned back to face her, his mind racing. He had spent hours piecing together the clues, connecting the dots between Ross's role in the company in the fraudulent activities. He knew the truth, but now it was about finding the pieces to fit. I can, Ethan replied. Ross was angry after he was fired. He felt betrayed by my father. But more than that, he had a personal vendetta. My father had started to scale back certain projects that Ross had been involved in, projects that were bringing in huge revenue but were also extremely risky. Ross wanted to secure his financial future, and when he was dismissed, he saw this as his only way out. The prosecutor stood up quickly. That's pure speculation. There's no evidence to suggest that Mr. Ross had anything to do with the alleged fraud. You're grasping at straws, Mr. Walker. But Ethan's gaze never wavered. I've already found the proof, Ms. Blake. Ross was using his old access codes to transfer money out of the company accounts, and he's been covering his tracks ever since. The judge looked over at the prosecution. Ms. Blake, if what Mr. Walker is suggesting is true, then we may have an entirely new avenue of investigation to pursue. I am ordering a full audit of Victor Ross's activities, and I expect a report before we reconvene. The prosecutor's face twisted with frustration, but she said nothing more. She knew when she had lost ground. Judge Clarkson turned to Ethan. Mr. Walker, this court will consider this new evidence carefully. You've done well in uncovering these details. But remember, the burden of proof lies with the defense. I understand, Your Honor, Ethan said, his voice steady. But I'm confident in what I've found. I'll prove my father's innocence, no matter what it takes. With a sharp rap of his gavel, Judge Clarkson concluded the session. We'll adjourn for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow after the audit is completed. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't done yet. But he had made a massive leap forward. Victor Ross was the key. And Ethan was going to make sure everyone saw the truth. The following day, Ethan's mind was racing. Every moment felt crucial, every decision weighed heavily on his shoulders. He had a sense of urgency as he prepared for the court session, knowing that Victor Ross was the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. The audit that Judge Clarkson had ordered would either validate or destroy everything he'd worked for. If it turned out that Ross had been embezzling funds or using company resources to frame his father, then it would be the proof they needed. But there was one problem: Ross had been meticulous. He knew the company's systems inside and out, and Ethan had no doubt that he would have hidden any trace of his activities. The files and documents Ethan had found weren't enough to implicate Ross definitively. The real evidence was buried deep, hidden in a labyrinth of digital files and encrypted records. Ethan sat at his desk in the small office he'd set up at the courthouse, a pile of legal papers scattered before him. His laptop hummed quietly, and the only light in the room was from the screen as he searched through what he had, everything from financial records to internal emails. Most of it seemed irrelevant, but Ethan wasn't ready to give up. If there was one thing he had learned from years of watching his father work, it was that nothing was ever as it seemed. He typed furiously, looking for any indication of a pattern. His mind flickered back to the documents he'd seen the day before, details that didn't match up with what the prosecution was claiming. Ross had left a trail, even if it was a small one. Ethan knew that if he could find the right link, everything would fall into place. Suddenly, a notification popped up on his screen. It was an encrypted message from an unknown sender. Ethan hesitated before opening it. The email was short, cryptic: "Look under the second tier of files. If you're looking for the real records, you need to go deeper. V." Ethan froze. His pulse quickened. He knew immediately who the V was. It had to be Victor Ross. The message was clear: Ross had left him a breadcrumb, a signal that there was something more beneath the surface of the files he had already uncovered. He quickly opened the file folder on his computer, navigating to the second-tier files as the message instructed. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. There it was, a series of transactions that had been masked under false company codes. It wasn't just money being transferred, it was entire accounts being siphoned off. But the most shocking part wasn't the financial fraud. It was the fact that these transactions were being rerouted to a bank account registered under a false name, Victor Ross's alias. Ethan's hands trembled as he zoomed in on the transaction records. This was the breakthrough he needed. Ross hadn't just been manipulating company funds. He had been using a secret identity to funnel the money into his own personal accounts. And what's more, these transactions were timed precisely after his dismissal from the company. This was the smoking gun. Ethan quickly copied the files to a secure drive and sent them over to Mr. Nelson. He didn't have much time. The court session was starting soon, and he needed the information to be presented properly. Later that morning, as the court reconvened, Ethan felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. His heart was racing, but he kept his focus on the task at hand. He had the evidence. He was finally going to expose Ross for what he truly was. Judge Clarkson called the session to order. The tension in the room was palpable as both the defense and prosecution took their seats. "Mr. Walker, I trust you have additional evidence to support your claims." Judge Clarkson's voice was steady but expectant. Ethan stood up, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. His hands gripped the edge of the table as he spoke. "Yes, Your Honor. I've uncovered a series of fraudulent transactions that were made by Victor Ross after his dismissal from my father's company. These transactions were carefully hidden, but I've traced them back to Ross's personal bank account." The courtroom went still. Every eye was on Ethan as he pulled up the encrypted files on the screen in front of the judge. The documents flashed up, showing the transactions, the alias, and the hidden bank account. "Here," Ethan said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "These transactions were carried out using a false identity, a name that Victor Ross was using to cover his tracks. I've traced these funds, and they were all rerouted directly to him. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate fraud." Allison Blake's face paled as she studied the documents. For the first time, the prosecutor looked rattled. She stood up abruptly, but Ethan could see that she was struggling to maintain her composure. "This is absurd," Blake scoffed. "These documents could easily have been fabricated. Mr. Walker, you can't expect us to believe that these files are legitimate." But Ethan wasn't deterred. "I've verified these documents with internal records from the company's system. These transactions were encrypted and hidden for a reason. Victor Ross was attempting to cover his tracks. He's the one who's been framing my father." Judge Clarkson glanced between the prosecutor and the defense, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Blake, can you refute these findings? Are these documents not legitimate?" Blake faltered, clearly on the defensive. Well, I haven't had a chance to properly analyze them yet. But that doesn't mean they're real." Ethan's lawyer, Mr. Nelson, spoke up, his tone firm. "Your Honor, the evidence we've presented clearly points to Victor Ross as the individual responsible for these fraudulent actions. We request that the court allow for a full investigation into his role in this matter." The judge nodded slowly. "I will allow a full investigation into Victor Ross's involvement. However, I also want the prosecution to examine these documents thoroughly before we proceed. We will reconvene tomorrow morning with updates from both sides." As the session ended, Ethan felt a sense of cautious victory. It wasn't over yet, but the truth was finally being heard. He had proven that his father wasn't the one behind the fraud, it was Ross. And the court had no choice but to investigate further. As he walked out of the courtroom with his mother by his side, Ethan allowed himself a moment to breathe. "You did it," Clara whispered, her voice filled with relief. "You've shown them the truth." Ethan nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The battle was far from over. Victor Ross was still out there, and there were still more pieces of the puzzle to uncover. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. He was on the right path. And nothing, not even Ross, was going to stop him. The following morning, Ethan couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as the judge had scheduled a reconvened session. All the evidence was now on the table, and Ethan's focus had never been sharper. He was so close to revealing the truth, but he couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. There was something about Victor Ross, about the way he had operated for so long, that made Ethan question how much deeper this conspiracy went. "Ready?" Clara asked as she adjusted her jacket, looking at her son with a mixture of pride and worry. Ethan smiled but didn't answer immediately. His mind was elsewhere. The night before, he had stayed up late, double-checking every piece of evidence, looking for any hint that he might have missed something. Despite the excitement from the previous day's revelations, Ethan knew that Victor Ross wasn't the kind of person who would just sit back and let this unfold. Ross had been covering his tracks for months, he wasn't going to be caught that easily. As they walked into the courtroom, Ethan's heart rate picked up. The heavy wood of the court benches, the sterile air, the shuffle of lawyers and witnesses, it all felt familiar, but today was different. Today, the stakes were higher. Everything rested on the next few hours. Judge Clarkson called the session to order. His gavel echoed through the room, cutting through the tension. Ethan stood tall beside Mr. Nelson, ready to present the evidence that would seal his father's fate. Clara sat quietly in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "We are here today to continue the investigation into the charges brought against Mr. Greg Walker," Judge Clarkson said, his voice firm. "Yesterday, the defense presented new evidence suggesting that a former employee, Victor Ross, may have been involved in fraudulent activities. The court has instructed both parties to further investigate these claims. Mr. Nelson, you may proceed." Mr. Nelson stood and gave a brief nod. He was confident, and rightfully so. "Your Honor, the defense has uncovered substantial evidence linking Victor Ross to the fraudulent transactions that were initially thought to be linked to Mr. Walker. As we presented in our last session, Mr. Ross's actions were not isolated incidents. They were deliberate, calculated, and involved large sums of money being transferred under a false identity." The courtroom murmured. Ethan couldn't help but notice the prosecutor's tense posture. Allison Blake, who had once been so certain of her case, now looked rattled. "Mr. Nelson, I have examined the documents you provided, and I would like to address the court's concerns," Blake said, standing up. Her voice was cold, but it lacked her usual edge. "While it is true that certain transactions appear suspicious, there is no clear evidence linking Victor Ross directly to the fraudulent actions. There are too many questions, too many variables that have yet to be explained." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He knew what Blake was trying to do. She was trying to undermine the investigation, make the court second-guess the legitimacy of the evidence. But this time, he was ready for it. "Your Honor," Blake continued, "I request that we take more time to investigate this new lead. A full audit of Mr. Ross's financial records has not yet been conducted, and it is crucial that we follow the correct procedures before making any assumptions. Judge Clarkson looked at the prosecutor with a thoughtful expression. Ms. Blake, I understand your concerns. However, the court has already granted a sufficient amount of time to examine the evidence presented. I expect a clear conclusion before the next session. Blake's face tightened, and for a moment, she hesitated. Of course, Your Honor. But I still believe this investigation is premature. We cannot make a decision based solely on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. Ethan saw an opening. This was his chance to strike. He couldn't let Blake stall for time. Not now. Not when they were so close to exposing the truth. Your Honor, Ethan said, rising to his feet, his voice steady and clear. I understand the prosecutor's concerns, but I have additional evidence. Evidence that will definitively prove Victor Ross's guilt. A ripple of tension swept through the room. Blake's face paled, and for the first time, Ethan saw her falter. What do you mean, Mr. Walker? Judge Clarkson asked, his tone intrigued. I've uncovered more than just transaction records, Ethan replied. I've obtained security footage from the company's main office, footage that shows Victor Ross using a laptop to access internal files, files that only a select few employees had access to. The footage clearly shows Ross manipulating these files and initiating the transfers we've been discussing. Ethan could see the shock spread across the courtroom. This was the proof they needed. The footage, which Ethan had received from a trusted source within the company, showed Ross in action, no more ambiguity, no more guesswork. This was damning. Mr. Nelson quickly retrieved a tablet from his briefcase and played the footage for the court. The video was grainy, but the figure in the footage was unmistakably Ross. He was sitting in a dark office, typing quickly on a laptop. On the screen, the bank transfer records could be seen moving from one account to another, each transfer increasing in value. Blake's face drained of color as she watched the footage. She couldn't deny what was right in front of her. The truth was undeniable. This doesn't prove anything, Blake finally managed to stammer. This could be anyone, and the footage is not time-stamped. You can't just assume it's Ross. But it was too late for her objections. The video told the story clearly. Even without the timestamp, the company's internal records would verify the timeline of these transactions. And Blake knew it. Your Honor, Ethan continued, his voice firm, this is the final piece of the puzzle. Victor Ross is the one who orchestrated this entire fraud. He used his position within the company to manipulate internal systems, all while framing my father for crimes he didn't commit. I have no doubt that Ross is responsible for the scheme. Blake stood silent, her mouth set in a tight line. She had no rebuttal left. Judge Clarkson leaned back in his chair, his gavel in hand. The court will reconvene tomorrow, after further review of the new evidence. I expect the prosecution to provide a response, but the validity of these findings is clear. Mr. Walker, I commend you for your perseverance. Ethan sat back down, his heart still racing, but a sense of triumph washed over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had exposed Ross's manipulation, and the pieces were falling into place. But as the court session came to a close and Ethan packed his briefcase, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Ross was planning his next move. The battle was far from over. Ross wasn't just going to give up, he had too much at stake. Ethan was ready for whatever came next. Ethan walked out of the courtroom, his mind still buzzing with adrenaline. The victory, small as it was, felt enormous. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The footage he had presented was irrefutable. Victor Ross's actions had been laid bare for all to see. Ethan had done what he set out to do, he had exposed the fraud and cleared his father's name. But as Ethan walked down the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and checked the screen. It was a message from an unfamiliar number. "You're making a huge mistake, Ethan. You don't know who you're dealing with. Ross won't go down without a fight. Neither will you." His heart skipped a beat. For a second, his mind raced with possibilities. Was this just an empty threat? Or was it something more? Before he could think it through, another message came through. "You'll regret this." Ethan's stomach dropped. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Victor Ross wasn't just trying to cover his tracks anymore. He was willing to do anything to prevent his involvement from coming to light. Ethan wasn't just battling corporate fraud anymore, he was up against a dangerous man with resources and influence. Someone who wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. Clara was already waiting for him at the bottom of the courthouse steps, a concerned look on her face as she saw the tension in his expression. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft with worry. He showed her the messages, feeling a shiver crawl down his spine as she read them. "Who is this?" Clara asked, but Ethan couldn't answer. He didn't know. The message could have been from anyone, but the threats felt real. And Ross had never been the type to back down when cornered. "We need to be careful," Ethan said, his voice tense. "I think Ross knows we're onto him. He's not just going to let this go." Clara's eyes darkened with concern. "What do we do?" Ethan thought for a moment. The court session was over for now, but the investigation was far from finished. He couldn't afford to take his foot off the gas, but at the same time, he needed to be more cautious. He couldn't ignore the fact that someone, possibly Ross himself, was out there watching his every move. "First, I'll talk to Mr. Nelson. We need to get ahead of whatever Ross is planning," Ethan said, gripping the phone tightly. "And we need to protect ourselves. I'll talk to security at the courthouse, see if we can get some additional measures in place." Clara nodded, her concern growing. "Be careful. Ross isn't just an ordinary person. He's dangerous." "I know," Ethan said. "But I can't back down now. We're so close." That night, Ethan couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut. As much as he wanted to go to bed and get some rest, he knew he had to remain vigilant. Ross wasn't going to give up. The messages had made that clear. He sat in his small office at the courthouse, staring at his laptop. He reviewed the evidence again, making sure everything was in order for the next session. He needed to be prepared. The prosecution would undoubtedly try to fight back. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Then, another notification. This one wasn't a message. It was an alert from his security system at home. Ethan quickly opened the app on his phone. The video feed showed his house, all the lights off, except for a shadow moving near the front door. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but Ethan's blood ran cold. His mind raced, thinking back to the threat from earlier. Could it be Ross? Or someone working for him? Either way, the fact that someone was at his doorstep this late at night sent a rush of panic through him. Ethan grabbed his keys and rushed out of the office, adrenaline pumping. He wasn't about to let someone get to him, or to his family, without a fight. When he arrived at his home, the street was eerily quiet. The only sound was the faint rustling of trees in the wind. His eyes scanned the perimeter, looking for any sign of movement. He reached for his phone to check the security footage again, but the image was frozen. The person who had been there earlier was gone. His heart was pounding as he approached the front door. It was locked, and nothing seemed disturbed. But the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. He didn't feel safe here anymore, not with Ross potentially lurking in the shadows. Ethan stepped inside, double-checking all the locks and ensuring the windows were secure. Clara was already asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the danger he'd just narrowly avoided. But sleep wouldn't come for Ethan tonight. His mind kept running over the threats, the strange figure at his door. This was no longer just a legal battle. Ross had made it personal. The next morning, Ethan met with Mr. Nelson to discuss their strategy for the final court session. They had everything they needed to bring down Ross, but now they had to stay ahead of him. Ethan could sense that this case was heading toward a final confrontation, one that would determine not just his father's fate, but his own as well. "I'm worried, Mr. Nelson," Ethan admitted as they sat at the small conference table. "Ross is dangerous. He's not going to let this go quietly. I think he's already trying to intimidate us." Nelson listened intently, his face thoughtful. "You're right, Ethan. This is no longer just a matter of legal tactics. It's about survival. We need to keep our guard up. I'll get in touch with some people to ensure your safety, but for now, we continue pushing forward. We can't afford to back down." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. He wasn't going to let fear stop him. Ross had messed with the wrong family. And Ethan would do whatever it took to make sure that justice was served. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation, phone calls, and legal meetings. The clock was ticking, and Ethan knew that the final showdown was fast approaching. As he sat in the courtroom once more, ready to face Victor Ross and his defense team, Ethan couldn't help but think of all that had led up to this moment, the long hours, the late-night research, the constant threats, and it all led here. He had no intention of losing now. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the beginning of the final hearing. Ethan was ready to expose Ross once and for all. The courtroom was buzzing as Ethan sat down next to Mr. Nelson. He glanced around, taking in the faces of the people who had gathered for the final hearing. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to almost taste. Ethan's mind was focused, sharp like a blade. Today was the day. Today, they would bring down Victor Ross once and for all. The judge, a stern figure who had presided over the case for weeks now, banged his gavel to call the court to order. His gaze swept over the room, pausing for a moment on the defense table where Victor Ross sat, stone-faced and unmoving. The usual smugness that Ross had carried for the past few weeks had vanished, replaced by a subtle but noticeable nervousness. Even someone like Ross knew when the walls were closing in. "Mr. Nelson, you may proceed," Judge Clarkson's voice rang out, cutting through the thick silence. Nelson stood, adjusting his glasses as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today to finish what we started. The evidence presented against Mr. Ross is irrefutable. Through his actions, Mr. Ross has not only defrauded the Walker Corporation but has also systematically framed an innocent man, Greg Walker, for crimes he didn't commit. We have shown through witness testimony, financial records, and most importantly, security footage, that Mr. Ross is the mastermind behind this entire scheme." Ethan sat up straighter, his eyes meeting those of the prosecutor, Allison Blake, who sat at the opposite table. Her face was pale, and there was no trace of the confidence she had once carried. Blake had gone quiet ever since the footage had been presented, the one showing Ross manipulating the company's internal systems. Nelson continued, his voice steady, "We have established a clear link between Mr. Ross and the fraudulent activities at the Walker Corporation. But there is more. What we are about to present today will leave no room for doubt. Mr. Ross's involvement in the fraud is undeniable, and we are ready to prove it." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment of truth. It was time to end this. Nelson turned to Ethan. "Go ahead, Ethan. It's time to show the court what you found." Ethan nodded, rising from his seat. His hands were slightly clammy, but he had prepared for this moment. He had spent sleepless nights going over the case, double-checking every detail. The evidence was airtight. He stood before the jury, feeling their gaze on him. There was no turning back now. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ethan began, his voice firm, "the footage you saw last week is just the beginning. What I'm about to show you will demonstrate not just Mr. Ross's guilt, but the lengths he went to in order to cover his tracks." He clicked a button on the laptop, and a new set of documents appeared on the screen, bank records, email exchanges, and surveillance footage. It was a mountain of data, but Ethan knew every bit of it by heart. The first transaction you saw last week, Ethan continued, pointing to a screen displaying the footage of Ross at his office, was just one part of the larger scheme. But there's more. In this email, dated just 2 days before the fraudulent transfers began, Mr. Ross reached out to several high-level contacts in offshore banking. We have the evidence to show that these accounts were used to funnel large sums of money out of the Walker Corporation. The room fell into complete silence as the jury members leaned forward, reading the documents displayed on the screen. Even Judge Clarkson looked intently at the evidence. And this, Ethan said, his voice dropping as he clicked to the next piece of evidence, is an email sent from Mr. Ross to a business associate of his, instructing them to create false identities for the individuals involved in the fraudulent transfers. These identities were used to cover the tracks of the stolen funds. The defense team remained silent, though Ross's lawyer looked increasingly uncomfortable. But Victor Ross himself remained stoic, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to control the rising tension in the room. Ethan felt a surge of confidence. He was winning. Every piece of evidence he presented built the case against Ross stronger and stronger. This was the moment he had been working toward, the culmination of months of hard work, sleepless nights, and the relentless pursuit of justice for his father. And now, the most damning piece of evidence, Ethan said, pausing for dramatic effect. He clicked the mouse and brought up a new document, a direct transfer of funds from the Walker Corporation's account to a private offshore account controlled by none other than Victor Ross. The money from these fraudulent transfers, Ethan continued, his voice steady but full of conviction, was not just funneled into accounts abroad. It ended up in Mr. Ross's personal accounts. This document shows a direct transfer of $10 million into an account linked to Mr. Ross just days after the first fraudulent transaction. The courtroom gasped. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment. It was over. Ross was finished. Ethan looked directly at Ross, his voice unyielding. You may have thought you could get away with it, Mr. Ross. But now, everyone knows the truth. You used your position, your access to the Walker Corporation's resources, to steal millions of dollars. You framed my father for crimes he didn't commit, and for that, you will pay. Ross's face remained unreadable, but Ethan could see the slight tremor in his hands. His grip tightened on the armrest as if trying to steady himself. The battle was over. Ross knew it, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Judge Clarkson, who had been silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. Mr. Ross, do you have anything to say in your defense? Ross's lawyer stood up quickly, but it was clear that the air had already left their sails. They had nothing to counteract the overwhelming evidence that had just been laid out. Ross's world was collapsing around him. The defense attorney opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, then sat back down. Victor Ross himself stood up slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room. His eyes locked with Ethan's, and for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of something other than confidence, something that looked like fear. I have nothing to say, Ross said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. The judge nodded solemnly. Very well. The jury will deliberate and return with a verdict. The room was heavy with anticipation as the jury filed out to deliberate. Ethan sat back down next to Clara, who reached over and squeezed his hand. Her eyes were filled with pride, but she, too, knew that there was still a final piece to come, the verdict. Hours later, the jury returned. The foreperson stepped forward, holding the paper that would determine everything. Your Honor, we, the jury, find the defendant, Victor Ross, guilty of all charges, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud the Walker Corporation. The courtroom erupted into applause. Clara squeezed Ethan's hand tighter, and a sense of relief washed over him. It was done. Victor Ross had been brought to justice. The weight of the verdict hit Ethan harder than he expected. The courtroom had erupted in applause, people cheering for the conviction of Victor Ross. But as Ethan walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by his family and friends, he couldn't shake the lingering feeling of emptiness. He had won, yes, but it wasn't the kind of victory that filled him with joy. It was the relief of a battle that had taken too long and cost too much. As he walked down the steps with Clara by his side, his thoughts wandered back to the countless hours he'd spent in the courtroom, the sleepless nights reviewing evidence, and the gut-wrenching fear of losing everything. His father's name had been cleared, but it had come at a price. He had been dragged into a war against someone more powerful and dangerous than he could have ever imagined. "Are you okay?" Clara asked softly, her voice breaking through his thoughts. Ethan nodded absently, offering her a small, tired smile. "Yeah. It doesn't feel as great as I thought it would. It's over, but it's like something's still hanging over me." Clara squeezed his hand. "You fought for your dad. For what's right. You should be proud of yourself." "I know," Ethan said, though he didn't entirely believe it. The feeling of accomplishment was muted by a gnawing sense of uncertainty, a feeling that the battle wasn't truly over yet. Later that night, as Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop, he was struck by an unsettling thought. Victor Ross had been convicted, but there were still questions that remained unanswered. Who had been behind Ross's operations? How deep did the corruption run? Ross had been a key player, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't the only one involved. There had to be others, people who had enabled Ross, people who had benefited from his schemes. The gnawing feeling returned. Was Ross really finished, or was this just the beginning? Ethan's phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced down and saw a text message from Mr. Nelson. "Ethan, we need to talk. There are things you don't know yet. Call me as soon as you can." A chill ran through him. What else could there be? He quickly dialed Mr. Nelson's number, his mind racing with possibilities. "Ethan," Mr. Nelson answered quickly, his voice tense. "We need to meet. It's important. I'll send you the details." Without waiting for a reply, Mr. Nelson hung up. Ethan stared at the phone in his hand, his stomach sinking. There was something more, something hidden beneath the surface of this case that he hadn't uncovered yet. The next morning, Ethan met Mr. Nelson at a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Nelson was already seated at a corner table, his face drawn with concern. "Ethan, I wish I had better news," Mr. Nelson said, motioning for Ethan to sit. "There are still things we need to address. You've done a great job bringing down Ross, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his mind working quickly. "What do you mean?" "Ross is convicted. He's going to prison for the rest of his life. Isn't that enough?" Nelson shook his head. "Ross is just the tip of the iceberg. There's more to this case than you realize. Ross didn't act alone. He was part of a larger operation, a network of people who were pulling the strings behind the scenes." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Are you telling me this is bigger than Ross?" "Much bigger," Nelson said, his voice low. "I've been digging into this case for months now, and there are patterns I've noticed. People who've been protected, key players who've remained under the radar. It's not just corporate fraud. It's far more complicated than that." Ethan leaned in closer, his mind racing. "Who's behind it, then?" "I don't know yet," Nelson admitted. "But what I do know is that the conviction of Ross is only the beginning of exposing a much larger conspiracy. The people who've been profiting from this scandal are powerful, and they won't go down without a fight." Ethan's heart sank. He had been hoping for closure, a sense of finality. Instead, he found himself faced with a new, even more daunting challenge. "So, what now?" Ethan asked, trying to process the gravity of what Mr. Nelson had just said. "We keep digging," Nelson replied. "But this time, we have to be careful. Ross will talk, but it won't be easy. He has too many connections. And there are people who won't hesitate to stop us from getting to the truth. Ethan sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the new information settle on him. He thought about all the sleepless nights he had already spent, the sacrifices he had made to bring Ross to justice. Now, he had to prepare for an even more dangerous game. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. The case wasn't over. It had just begun. His thoughts turned to his father, still trying to rebuild his life after everything that had happened. The Walker Corporation was recovering, but the scars left by the scandal would take time to heal. Ethan had promised his dad that he'd clear his name, and he had. But now, there was more at stake than just clearing his father's reputation. There were others involved, and if he didn't expose them, they might slip through the cracks, continuing their schemes without anyone being the wiser. He thought back to the strange feeling he had during the trial, the nagging suspicion that something wasn't quite right. He had been so focused on Ross that he hadn't considered the bigger picture. He had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went, but he was about to find out. Ethan sat up, grabbing his phone. He quickly sent a message to Clara, "I need to talk to you. It's not over. I'm not sure what's coming, but it's bigger than Ross." He didn't expect a reply right away. Clara had been through so much already, and he didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. But Ethan knew he couldn't do this alone. He would need her by his side, just like she had been from the beginning. As he put the phone down and stared out the window, the first rays of sunlight creeping over the horizon, Ethan knew that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ross, his smug face on the witness stand, denying everything, only to be crushed by the weight of the evidence. But now, as the days passed, Ethan found himself wondering if that moment of victory had been just a fleeting relief. He was still in the middle of a storm, and there were more waves to come. The meeting with Mr. Nelson had shaken him. Ross's conviction wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of a much darker journey. As if the weight of the world had suddenly multiplied, Ethan felt the burden of something he wasn't sure he was prepared for. What kind of people were involved in this operation? How far did their influence stretch? And what if they weren't done with him yet? The text from Clara that evening had given him a small amount of comfort, but even her reassuring words couldn't keep the gnawing feeling from eating away at him. She had asked him to meet, to talk about what he had discovered, but he was still trying to process everything that Mr. Nelson had shared. He hadn't even told her about his concerns yet, he wasn't sure how to explain them without sounding paranoid. But as the minutes passed into hours, his resolve solidified. He needed answers. More than anything, he needed to be sure that the people who had been pulling Ross's strings would be held accountable. He wouldn't let them slip through his fingers, not after everything his family had been through. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing outside a nondescript office building on the edge of town. It looked like any other building, brick and glass, nothing special, but he knew better now. Everything had a purpose. Everything was connected, even the smallest of details. Mr. Nelson had told him to meet here. The place had been chosen carefully, far from the public eye. Whatever they were about to discuss, it wasn't something meant for the ears of the press or anyone who could jeopardize their investigation. He entered the building, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. The elevator doors slid open, and Ethan pressed the button to the top floor. His mind raced as he ascended, the weight of what he was about to learn threatening to crush him. When the elevator doors opened, Mr. Nelson was waiting for him. He was alone this time, his face grave. "Ethan," Nelson said, his voice low, "come with me. We don't have much time." The office was modest, barely any decoration. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and the desk was cluttered with paperwork, most of which looked like old files or case notes. Mr. Nelson motioned for Ethan to sit as he closed the door behind him. "Take a seat," Nelson said again, glancing out the window for a moment. "This isn't going to be easy." Ethan sat, trying to steady his nerves. "What's going on? What's bigger than Ross?" Nelson rubbed his temples. "What you need to understand is that Ross wasn't just running a corporate fraud operation. This was a network, an underground web that connects people in high places. And we've barely scratched the surface." Ethan's stomach dropped. "So, you're saying that Ross was just a pawn?" "Not exactly," Nelson replied, his gaze intense. "Ross was one of the key players, but he had help. Powerful people helped cover his tracks, people who didn't want to get their hands dirty. And the operation went far beyond Walker Corporation. Ross had ties to international figures, organized crime, even corrupt government officials. The fraud? It's the least of what they were involved in." Ethan felt his breath catch in his chest. "So, what are we talking about here? A criminal empire?" "Something like that," Nelson said, his eyes darkening. "I've been tracking this case for months now. Every step I've taken, I've uncovered more pieces of the puzzle. And I'm afraid the closer we get to the truth, the more dangerous it becomes." Ethan tried to process what Nelson was telling him. He had known the case was big, but he hadn't realized just how deep the corruption ran. "What do we do now?" "We go after them. But we need to be careful. Whoever is behind this has connections that reach far beyond anything we've encountered. They're going to be watching us." Ethan clenched his fists. The idea of being watched, of having enemies in the shadows, was something he'd never wanted. But now, it was his reality. Mr. Nelson opened a folder on the desk and slid it across to Ethan. Inside were photographs, documents, and names, all of which pointed to a network of people who had been in league with Ross. Some of the names were ones Ethan recognized, high-profile businessmen, former government officials, even a few people within the Walker Corporation who had been complicit in the fraud. But there were others, people he'd never heard of before. "Who are these people?" Ethan asked, flipping through the pages. "People who've been untouchable," Nelson said. "People who think they can get away with anything. But we're going to take them down." Ethan's mind raced as he absorbed the information. There were names he could follow, people to investigate. But the question gnawing at him was, who was pulling the strings? "You said this went beyond just Ross," Ethan said, looking up from the folder. "Who's at the top?" Nelson hesitated, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "I don't know for sure yet, but I'm beginning to think that whoever's in charge is someone we'd never expect. Someone with more power than Ross could ever dream of." Ethan's stomach twisted. "And they won't stop until they get what they want." "Exactly," Nelson said. "And they've already shown that they'll do anything to protect their secrets." Ethan stood up, his mind whirling. He couldn't let these people win. Not after everything he and his father had been through. Not after he'd come this far. "We need to take them down," Ethan said, his voice filled with determination. "Once and for all." Mr. Nelson nodded grimly. "We do. But we have to be smart. Every move we make from here on out could be our last. So whatever happens next, we need to be prepared." Ethan looked out the window, the city sprawling before him. It seemed so peaceful from up here, but he knew better now. Beneath the surface, a war was brewing, a war he was now fully entrenched in. He had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went, but he was determined to find out. For his father. For justice. And for the truth. The days following his meeting with Mr. Nelson felt like a blur. Ethan couldn't focus on anything other than the unsettling new information he had learned. His thoughts circled endlessly around the shadow network that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The deeper he dug, the more questions arose, and the more he realized just how dangerous this new battle would be. He spent hours going over the files Nelson had given him. The names and faces on the pages blurred together as he sifted through them, trying to make sense of the connections. Powerful figures in politics, business, law enforcement. Ethan couldn't believe how far the corruption reached. What started as a fight for his father's name had morphed into a full-fledged war against a hidden network of criminals, and Ethan knew that if he wasn't careful, he could lose more than just the case. Clara, ever supportive, had been checking in with him regularly, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to share the full extent of what he was dealing with. She had already gone through so much, and he didn't want to burden her with this new, dangerous reality. Besides, he wasn't sure how to explain it. He wasn't even sure he understood everything himself yet. The following week, Ethan arranged another meeting with Mr. Nelson. This time, it was in a quiet, secure location, a private room in a small cafe tucked away from the public. The place had a comforting, almost inconspicuous charm to it, and Ethan felt a little safer being there, away from the prying eyes he'd grown paranoid of in recent days. Nelson arrived early, as usual. The weight of the case had clearly taken its toll on him. His usually sharp suit was slightly rumpled, his face more drawn than Ethan had ever seen it. "Good to see you," Ethan said, trying to offer a smile. "How are you holding up?" Nelson didn't return the smile. "We're in deeper than I thought," he said, glancing around before sitting down across from Ethan. "I've been working non-stop, digging into every angle I can. But the people behind this, they're elusive. They know how to cover their tracks." Ethan nodded. "Who are they?" "You said before that there's someone at the top of this network. Do you have any idea who it is?" Nelson hesitated, leaning forward with a look of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm getting closer, but the closer I get, the more I realize how dangerous they are. I've dug into their financial records, their connections, but this isn't just a simple case of white-collar crime. These people are involved in things we don't even know about yet." "What do you mean?" Ethan pressed, his heart rate quickening. "What's worse than fraud and organized crime?" Nelson ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I think they're involved in something much bigger, something global. Smuggling, arms dealing, money laundering. They have their fingers in so many pots, it's hard to say where their operations end. And the worst part is, they've managed to stay invisible to the authorities for years." Ethan swallowed hard. "If that's true, we're talking about a whole new level of danger." "Exactly," Nelson replied. "And I'm afraid that the more we get involved, the more they'll do anything to shut us down." Ethan clenched his fists. He could feel his pulse throbbing in his temples. It had started as a fight for his family, for his father's name. Now, it was something far more terrifying. These people had been operating under the radar for so long, and the more he learned, the more he realized how powerful and ruthless they were. "So, what's our next step?" Ethan asked, trying to steady his voice. "We need to be smart," Nelson said. "I've set up a meeting with a source I've been tracking for a while. Someone who knows a lot about these people, but they're scared. They've already told me that they'll only talk if we meet on their terms. If we're not careful, this could be a trap." Ethan's stomach churned. "What kind of trap?" "The kind where they lure us in, only to turn us over to their people. We need to make sure we have a plan in place, and we need to go in prepared." Ethan nodded. "When is this meeting?" "Tomorrow night," Nelson replied. "I'll send you the details later, but we'll need to be careful. We can't trust anyone right now, especially not people who are this close to the network." As they finished their coffee, Ethan felt the weight of the situation sinking in. They weren't just dealing with criminals, they were dealing with a network of people who could vanish into the shadows without a trace. It felt like they were chasing ghosts, and the deeper they dug, the more they realized that those ghosts were deadly. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, going over the meeting details again and again. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the danger, it was the feeling that they were being watched. That everything they did was somehow anticipated. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Clara. "I miss you. You've been so distant lately. Is everything okay?" Ethan stared at the message, his heart heavy. He couldn't tell her the full truth. How could he? How could he explain that he was about to walk into a trap, that he was chasing a dangerous, powerful network, and that every step he took could lead to something far worse than he could have ever imagined? He typed a quick response, trying to keep it light. "I'm fine. Just been busy with work stuff. I'll be back to normal soon. Promise." But deep down, Ethan knew he wasn't fine. And he wasn't sure if he ever would be again. The truth was, he had crossed a line. And there was no going back now. The next evening, Ethan met Mr. Nelson at the designated location. They both arrived early, as planned, and waited in the shadows, watching every passerby with suspicion. The night was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows over the empty street. It was almost eerie how still everything felt. They didn't have to wait long. A man in a dark coat approached them from the alleyway. He didn't look like much, a scruffy middle-aged man with a nervous air about him, but Ethan knew better than to judge appearances. The man was the source they'd been waiting for. "Mr. Nelson," the man said, his voice shaky. "You're here. Let's get this over with," Nelson replied coldly, keeping his distance. The man glanced around nervously before speaking. "You're asking for information about people you shouldn't be. They're dangerous, you don't understand." "We understand more than you think," Nelson interrupted. "Tell us what you know." The man hesitated before handing them a small envelope. "This is everything. But you have to promise me you'll leave it alone after this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Ethan took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hand. Inside were documents, names, addresses, and codes that would take days to fully understand. But it was a start. It was more than they had before. And then, without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the night. As Ethan looked down at the envelope in his hands, he felt a mixture of relief and fear. They were closer than ever, but at what cost? The danger was no longer theoretical. It was real. And there was no turning back. The information in the envelope weighed heavily on Ethan's mind as he and Mr. Nelson walked back to the car. The man who had handed them the envelope had been nervous, almost paranoid. But Ethan understood why. What they now had in their possession could bring down some of the most powerful figures in the world, a dangerous thing to hold, especially if you weren't protected. As they drove through the quiet streets, Ethan's mind raced through the details they'd just uncovered. The names in the envelope were linked to high-ranking officials, both within the business world and beyond. But the codes, those were the real mystery. They seemed like something out of a spy novel, a cipher that could unlock even deeper secrets. "I don't know about you, but I'm not sure how I feel about all this," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "We've got all this evidence now, but who do we trust to help us? These people aren't just criminals, they're untouchable." Mr. Nelson remained silent for a moment, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. "You're right. The deeper we go, the more dangerous this becomes. But we're not backing down now. We can't. If we expose this, if we can prove what we've learned, it's going to change everything. But we need to be careful about who we trust. There's too much at stake." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "I don't care about the danger anymore. If these people are really behind all of this, if they've been ruining lives for years, then they need to be stopped. It's not just about my dad anymore." Nelson gave him a sideways glance. "You're right. It's bigger than any one person. But you've got to remember, Ethan, there's a reason why they've been able to stay in the shadows for so long. The people we're dealing with are ruthless. And they'll do anything to protect themselves." The reality of what they were facing was starting to sink in. For weeks, Ethan had been fighting for justice for his father. But now he was fighting for something much larger, a chance to bring down an entire network that had thrived in the darkness for years. Later that night, after returning home, Ethan pored over the documents, trying to make sense of the codes. He sat at his desk, his laptop open in front of him, the glow from the screen casting shadows across the room. The codes seemed like random letters and numbers, but Ethan had an unsettling feeling that they held the key to everything. They were more than just a puzzle, they were the final piece. He typed out one of the codes into an online cipher decoder, praying for a breakthrough. After a few tense moments, the screen flickered and displayed the result. Alpha 19, the Black Summit. Ethan frowned, his pulse quickening. The Black Summit? What the hell was that? It didn't make any sense. But that phrase, it felt familiar, as if it was something he'd heard in passing, but couldn't place. He dug deeper, searching for any information he could find on the term Black Summit. But there was nothing. No mention of it in any database, no articles, no records. It was as if the term had been erased from existence. But then, in the corner of his eye, Ethan spotted something, a connection. A name he'd seen earlier in one of the files from the envelope, Carter Rhoades. He'd been listed as one of the key figures linked to the Shadow Network, but the information surrounding him was vague, almost non-existent. Whoever he was playing a far more important role than just a corporate executive. He searched Carter Rhoades' name and found a few news articles, nothing substantial, but enough to get a glimpse of his profile. He was an investor, a philanthropist, someone who frequented high society circles. But there was no mention of any criminal activity. In fact, there was hardly any mention of him at all outside of charity events and business dealings. Except for one thing. A single photo appeared in the search results. It was a blurry image from a gala, taken years ago, where a younger Rhoades was seen shaking hands with various powerful figures. One of them was a familiar face, Senator Alan Richards, one of the people listed in the files Mr. Nelson had handed him. Ethan leaned in, zooming in on the image. There was a particular look in the senator's eyes, something hidden, something dangerous. He had no doubt now. The Black Summit was not just a code, it was a gathering. A meeting place for those at the top of the Shadow Network. And Carter Rhoades was at the center of it. The next morning, Ethan called Mr. Nelson. "We need to meet. I found something." "I'll be there in an hour," Nelson replied, his voice sounding both urgent and cautious. When they sat down together, Ethan handed Nelson the printout of the photo. "This is it. I've connected Rhoades to the senator and to the Black Summit. That's the meeting place. It's the key. If we can find it, we can take them down." Nelson studied the photo, his face hardening. "This is big. Carter Rhoades has connections everywhere. If he's the one running this show, it's even worse than I thought." "So we go after him," Ethan said. "We find the Black Summit and expose everything. We have the proof we need now. We can't wait any longer." Nelson hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. "We can't just go barging in. If we're wrong, or if we tip them off, everything we've worked for will be gone. We need to be strategic. We need to get inside that summit, get a look at their operations firsthand." Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't wait. Every hour that passed felt like a missed opportunity to bring them down. But he also understood that Nelson was right, they couldn't afford to make a mistake. "How do we get in?" Ethan asked. "I have a contact," Nelson said, his eyes narrowing. "Someone who has been to one of their meetings before. But we have to be careful. This contact's been on the run ever since. If we're going to do this, we need to be prepared for anything." Ethan nodded, the plan starting to take shape. The Black Summit was no longer just a cryptic term, it was the key to everything, and it was within their reach. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. They were walking a tightrope, and one wrong move could send them crashing down. Ethan could feel it now, the weight of everything that had led him to this point. His father's name, the hidden network, the lives that had been ruined. The pieces were all coming together. But with each piece came more danger. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his footing. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Every move they made felt like it was being watched, every conversation laced with suspicion. But Ethan couldn't afford to dwell on paranoia. He had a mission now, one that had moved far beyond his personal fight for justice. The shadow network was vast, and it was clear that it would take everything he had to dismantle it. Mr. Nelson's contact, a former associate of Carter Rhoades, had agreed to meet them in person, under strict conditions. The man had been on the run for years, hiding from people who could erase him without a second thought. He had crucial information about the Black Summit, but he was hesitant to share it, too much at risk, too many lives in danger. Ethan understood. But he also knew that they didn't have time to waste. That evening, they met in a secluded bar on the outskirts of town, a quiet place that didn't draw attention. As they entered, the dim lights and the smell of whiskey created an atmosphere of unease. The walls were lined with heavy velvet curtains, and the air was thick with the sound of murmured conversations. Ethan scanned the room, taking in every detail, his nerves on edge. There was no turning back now. He could feel the weight of everything on his shoulders. He was about to face the very heart of the darkness he had been chasing. The Black Summit wasn't just a meeting, it was a fortress, a place where the most powerful and dangerous figures in the world converged. Nelson led the way to a back booth, where their contact was already seated. He was a small, wiry man, his face gaunt and lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, eyes that had seen too much. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. "You came," the man said quietly, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the bar. "We need answers," Nelson said, sitting across from him. Ethan followed suit, feeling the weight of the moment. This man was their last hope for breaking into the Black Summit. Without him, they were nothing but blind players in a dangerous game. The man looked around nervously before speaking again. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you're up against. If they find out you're trying to infiltrate them, you're as good as dead." "We're already dead if we don't do something," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We need to know everything. Where is the Black Summit? How do we get in?" The man hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. "I've been to one meeting," he said, his voice tight with reluctance. "But I didn't stay long. Once you see what happens in those rooms, you can never unsee it. It's a power play, a display of control. They make the rules. And the people who go there, they leave changed. You think you can bring them down? You can't." Ethan leaned in, determined. "We can. We will. Tell us what we need to know." The man's gaze softened slightly, and he sighed. "All right. The summit meets in a different location each time, but there's a pattern. It's always somewhere remote, somewhere secluded, away from prying eyes. They use private properties, islands, old estates, places where they can control everything. I don't know the exact location of the next meeting, but I know how to get there." Ethan's heart raced. "How?" "A private network. They use encrypted channels to send out invitations. You need a code to get in, no code, no entry." The man pulled a small notebook from his pocket and slid it across the table. "This is what you need to get the code. But it's not easy. You'll need to infiltrate their operation first, gain their trust. Only then will they let you in." Ethan took the notebook, feeling a sense of urgency settle in his chest. "Where do we start?" The man looked up at him, his eyes grave. "You need to go after Rhoades. He's the one who controls everything. If you can get to him, you can get to the summit. But be warned, he's not someone you want to cross. I know, Ethan said, his voice hard. We'll do whatever it takes. The man stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But remember, once you're in, there's no coming back. You'll be in their world, and they won't let you out. The next few days were a blur of planning and strategy. Ethan and Nelson worked tirelessly, going over every scrap of information they had, trying to piece together a plan to infiltrate Rhoades' operation. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Carter Rhoades wasn't just any businessman, he was a mastermind, and everything about him had been carefully constructed to hide his true nature. They had no choice but to play their part. Ethan's mind kept returning to the Black Summit. The more he learned, the more he realized just how deep this network went. It wasn't just about money or power, it was about control. These people, these untouchable figures, had found a way to manipulate the very systems that were supposed to protect society. They could make or break lives with the flip of a switch. And Ethan was about to walk right into their lair. The day of the meeting arrived quickly. Nelson had arranged for them to attend a high-profile charity event where Rhoades would be making an appearance. It was their chance to get close, to make their move. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was their only shot. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. The sharp suit he wore was meant to blend in with the elite, but beneath the polished exterior, his heart raced. Every moment felt like a step closer to the abyss. You ready? Nelson asked, his voice steady but with a hint of concern in his eyes. As ready as I'll ever be, Ethan replied, forcing himself to smile. Remember, Nelson said, his tone serious, we're not just going to this event for show. We're going to get close to Rhoades. We need to learn everything we can about the Black Summit. I know, Ethan said, his voice tight with resolve. We're not leaving without the truth. As they made their way to the event, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. He could feel the weight of their mission pressing on him, but he wasn't about to turn back now. The Black Summit awaited. The event was a glittering spectacle, an invitation-only charity gala held at one of the most extravagant venues in the city. It was a night of elegance, where the rich and powerful mingled behind polished smiles and costly attire. The chandeliers above cast a soft golden glow, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere, but beneath the surface, Ethan could feel the tension crawling up his spine. This wasn't just a night of charity. This was his chance to get close to Carter Rhoades, and the Black Summit. But getting to him wouldn't be easy. The room was filled with people who held the keys to the world's most powerful secrets. Ethan and Nelson entered the venue with the air of people who belonged there. They both wore well-tailored suits, their attire fitting in perfectly with the crowd of corporate moguls and socialites. Ethan felt the weight of his mission pressing down on him, but he masked it with a calm exterior. He had to act like one of them, smile, shake hands, blend in. As they navigated through the crowd, Ethan couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the guests' cheerful demeanor and the underlying sense of danger that permeated the room. This was a world of shadows and whispers, a place where decisions were made behind closed doors, far from the public eye. Nelson leaned in and whispered, Rhoades is supposed to give a speech in about an hour. If we want to get close, we need to make our move now. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of their target. Carter Rhoades was an enigma, always impeccably dressed, always surrounded by a circle of influential people. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings of the network Ethan had been fighting against for months. Do you think he knows we're here? Ethan asked, his voice tight with the weight of the question. No, Nelson replied, not yet. But we need to stay under the radar. Make contact, find a way to get closer to him, and don't draw attention to ourselves. Ethan swallowed hard. It was easier said than done. Everything about this place felt like a trap, every smile a mask, every handshake a potential threat. The longer they stayed, the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. After what felt like an eternity, they spotted Rhoades across the room, standing in a corner near a group of well-dressed individuals. He was tall, with neatly combed dark hair and a confident posture that radiated power. He looked every bit the part of the billionaire businessman, but there was something colder in his eyes, something calculating. Nelson nodded in his direction. "That's him." Ethan felt a surge of nervous energy as they moved toward the group. The closer they got, the more aware he became of the high-level executives, politicians, and influencers surrounding Rhoades. It was like stepping into a den of wolves, all of them playing a part in this web of corruption. Ethan couldn't afford to make a misstep. As they approached, Nelson broke away from Ethan and introduced himself to one of the guests, a wealthy investor who had been eyeing them curiously. Ethan, left alone for the moment, steeled himself and turned his attention back to Rhoades. It was now or never. He had to make his move. Taking a deep breath, Ethan walked up to a small cluster of people who were speaking with Rhoades. He waited for a lull in the conversation before introducing himself. "Mr. Rhoades," Ethan said smoothly, extending a hand. "I'm Ethan Blake. It's an honor to finally meet you. I've heard a great deal about your charitable work." Rhoades looked at him for a moment, appraising him as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Ethan felt the pressure of his gaze, but he didn't flinch. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. "Ah, Ethan Blake, of course," Rhoades replied, his voice calm but filled with an underlying authority. "I've heard your name as well. You've made quite an impression on the business community, haven't you?" Ethan forced a smile. "I try to keep busy. I'm passionate about giving back." Rhoades nodded. "It's always good to see young people get involved. The world needs more of that." He glanced over at one of his companions, and then back at Ethan. "But let's not waste time with pleasantries. You're here for a reason, aren't you?" Ethan's pulse quickened. Rhoades was sharper than he had expected. "I suppose I'm curious about your work beyond the charity, Mr. Rhoades. You're involved in so many industries, technology, politics, even global finance. What drives you?" Rhoades' eyes narrowed slightly, and a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I've always believed in the power of influence, Mr. Blake. Influence is what moves the world, after all. And influence is something I've spent my life cultivating." The words were carefully chosen, but the implication was clear. Rhoades wasn't just a businessman, he was someone who understood the mechanics of power and control at a level most people could only dream of. Ethan needed to tread carefully. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, keeping his tone light. "I imagine that kind of influence doesn't come easily." Rhoades chuckled softly. "Nothing worth having ever does." Ethan knew this conversation wasn't going to give him the answers he was looking for, not directly, anyway. But it was a step closer to understanding Rhoades, to getting a glimpse into the mind of the man who held the key to the Black Summit. "Mr. Rhoades," Ethan said, lowering his voice, "I've heard there's something truly special about your next venture. Something big. Can you tell me more about it?" Rhoades' eyes glinted, and he leaned in slightly, as if about to reveal a secret. "Ah, well, let's just say that some things are too big for the public to understand just yet. But soon, very soon, everything will fall into place." Ethan couldn't help but feel a chill at his words. There was something unsettling about the way Rhoades spoke, like he was preparing for something monumental, something that would shift the balance of power. And Ethan had no doubt that whatever it was tied to the Black Summit. Before he could respond, a man in a dark suit stepped up to Rhoades' side, whispering something in his ear. Rhoades nodded, then turned back to Ethan with a polite smile. "I'm afraid I have business to attend to, Mr. Blake," Rhoades said smoothly, his tone dismissive now. "But it was a pleasure speaking with you. Perhaps we'll meet again soon." Ethan took a step back, forcing a smile as Rhoades turned to leave with his entourage. It was clear that the man wasn't going to give him anything more tonight. But something in the way he'd spoken about his next venture, and the way he dismissed Ethan, made him think that Rhoades knew far more about what was going on than he was letting on. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nelson reconvened, their brief conversation with Rhoades leaving them with more questions than answers. They had gotten close, but not close enough. The Black Summit remained elusive, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the waters became. "I didn't get much out of him," Ethan said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I know one thing for sure. Rhoades is involved in something much bigger than charity." Nelson nodded. "I think we both know that. But we're getting closer. We've just got to be patient." Ethan wasn't sure how much longer he could be patient. His mind kept returning to the Black Summit, the mystery of it, the power it held. And he was running out of time. The following days felt like a constant balancing act, a tug-of-war between the need to gather information and the risk of being discovered. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a razor's edge, one misstep, and everything would unravel. The Black Summit was closing in, but they were still blind to its true nature, to what Rhoades and his network were really planning. Nelson had managed to dig up some additional intel in the aftermath of the gala. It was slow progress, but they were getting closer. Rhoades wasn't just a businessman, he was part of a global system, a shadow government that controlled industries, politicians, and even entire economies. The Black Summit wasn't just a meeting of elites, it was a covert organization with one goal, to control everything. Ethan's mind kept turning over the same question: how could he bring it all down? It was late one night when Nelson arrived with a lead, a piece of the puzzle that could finally give them a clear path forward. "You're not going to believe this," Nelson said, his voice low, eyes darting around the room as if afraid someone might overhear. "I've got a source who's been watching Rhoades' inner circle. There's a meeting scheduled, one that's going to be the next big step for the Black Summit." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Where? When?" "A remote estate, somewhere in the mountains, 2 days from now. Only the top members of the organization are invited. They're calling it The Gathering. From what I've been able to piece together, this is where they finalize all major decisions." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. This was it. The Black Summit wasn't just a theory anymore. It was real. And he was about to walk right into the heart of it. "Do you know how we get in?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with urgency. Nelson paused, his fingers tapping on the desk. "There's a code that circulates within Rhoades' network. It's sent out just hours before the event to ensure that only invited members can attend. Without it, we won't get past the gates." Ethan's mind raced. A code. That's how they'd protect the meeting, but it also meant they were locked out unless they could get their hands on it. There was no way they'd be able to break into that kind of network undetected. "We'll need help," Ethan said, his thoughts already moving faster than he could voice them. "I'll contact the old team. If anyone can crack an encrypted system, it's them." Nelson raised an eyebrow. "You trust them?" "I trust the mission," Ethan replied. "We don't have time to waste." Nelson didn't question him further, but his expression suggested he was uneasy about bringing in outside help. Still, he knew the urgency of the situation, and they both understood that this was the only way forward. The next day, Ethan made the call. It had been a long time since he'd reached out to his former team. Their skills were unmatched, but so was their reputation for being ruthless. The people he'd worked with in the past were experts at navigating the gray areas of the law. It was why they were perfect for this mission. But Ethan knew the risks. This wasn't just a heist, it was a war against an empire that could crush them without hesitation. He dialed the number, and the phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Ethan," came the voice on the other end. "It's been a while." "Too long, Jake," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I need your help. This is bigger than anything we've ever done." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers shuffling. "Bigger than the heist in Paris? The one that nearly got us all killed?" Ethan grinned despite the gravity of the situation. Much bigger. I'll explain when I see you. But we need you and the team. This isn't just about money, it's about taking down a network that controls everything. Jake was silent for a moment before he spoke again. All right, I'm in. But you better have a damn good plan. I don't want to end up in another black site. I've got it, Ethan said. Meet me tomorrow. I'll send the coordinates. The next day, Ethan and Nelson met up with Jake and the rest of the team in an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The team was as diverse as it was skilled: Jake, the tech wizard, who could crack any system; Maria, the logistics expert, who could get them in and out of anywhere; and Mark, the muscle, silent but deadly. Together, they'd been an unstoppable force in the past. Now, they were united once again, but this time, they were up against something far more dangerous. Ethan briefed them on everything he knew: the Black Summit, Rhoades network, the upcoming gathering, and their mission to infiltrate it. All right, here's the deal, Jake said, tapping on his laptop and bringing up an encrypted file. This is the Black Summit's internal communication. The code for the gathering is in here. But cracking it won't be easy. Can we do it? Ethan asked, his voice tight. Jake's fingers flew across the keyboard as he spoke. We've got the tools, but it'll take a couple of hours to break through their encryption. I can't promise we won't be detected, though. If they catch us, this whole thing is over before it even begins. I trust you, Ethan said. We don't have a choice. We move in 2 hours. Maria stepped forward with a quiet nod. I'll get us transport. We'll need to move fast, and we need to be prepared for anything. Once we're in, we're on their turf. And I don't need to tell you what happens if they catch us. Ethan glanced at Mark, who didn't speak but gave a small, reassuring nod. They were ready. They had no other choice. Let's get this done, Ethan said, his voice resolute. 2 hours later, the plan was set into motion. Jake had successfully cracked the encrypted code, and they had everything they needed to infiltrate the Black Summit's next meeting. The team geared up and loaded into an unmarked van, ready for whatever awaited them. As the van sped toward the remote estate where the meeting would take place, Ethan felt a mix of anticipation and dread. This was it, the moment they'd been working toward for so long. But the closer they got, the more he realized just how dangerous the situation was. They weren't just up against Rhoades. They were up against a system that controlled everything. The estate loomed in the distance, massive, fortified, and guarded. This wasn't just an event. It was a fortress. And Ethan was about to breach it. The van rumbled along the narrow, winding road that led up to the remote estate. The landscape was dark, enveloped by tall trees that blocked out most of the stars above. The estate, as Jake had warned them, was heavily fortified. There were high walls, security cameras at every corner, and guards patrolling the perimeter. It looked less like a private residence and more like a military stronghold. Ethan's heart raced as the van slowed to a stop just outside the estate's gates. He could see the imposing silhouette of the mansion ahead, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. The place was crawling with security, and there was no doubt that the Black Summit took every precaution to protect their secrets. But that only made the stakes higher. This was their chance, maybe their only chance, to finally take down the organization from within. All right, team, Ethan whispered, keeping his voice low as he turned to the others. We stick to the plan. Jake, you're our eyes and ears. If anything goes wrong, we'll need you to keep us in the loop. Maria, get us inside. Mark, stay sharp. Everyone nodded, the weight of the situation settling in. They had come a long way to get here, and there was no turning back now. The success of this mission meant everything. If they were caught, it wouldn't just be the end of their operation. It would be the end of everything they had worked for. Here goes nothing, Maria said, her fingers tapping a few buttons on her tablet to activate the hacking device she'd been working on. She looked at her team one last time before giving the signal. "We're in." With a quiet hiss, the security gates opened, and the van rolled through, blending in with the other vehicles that were arriving for the event. No one seemed to pay them much attention as they drove past the guards and up the long driveway leading to the estate. As they approached the main entrance, Maria parked the van in a discreet corner, out of view from most of the estate. She turned to the team. "We've got an hour before the event officially starts. Let's use that time to find out where Rhoades is and get a sense of the layout. I'll be in touch with Jake the whole time." Ethan gave her a thumbs up. "Let's move out." The team split into pairs as they entered the estate. Ethan and Mark would focus on getting closer to Rhoades, while Maria and Jake would work from the shadows, gathering any intel they could find. They had no idea what the Black Summit had planned for the night, but they were certain it wouldn't be good. As they walked through the grand entrance of the mansion, Ethan marveled at the opulence. The floors were polished marble, and the walls were adorned with priceless art. It was the kind of place that screamed power, wealth, and influence. A world completely removed from the everyday struggles most people faced. But to Ethan, it was just another mask, another distraction. They followed the flow of guests into the main hall, where they were greeted by well-dressed staff offering drinks and hors d'oeuvres. The place was buzzing with conversation, and Ethan could see powerful people from every corner of the world, financiers, politicians, and tech moguls. It was a social labyrinth, each person carefully positioned to maintain their image. Mark leaned in, his voice low. "This is the nerve center of the Black Summit. Rhoades has to be here somewhere. Let's move." They navigated through the crowd, staying in the shadows as much as possible, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of their target. Ethan could feel the weight of every pair of eyes that swept across them, but they didn't stop. The deeper they went into the mansion, the more it felt like they were crossing an invisible line, stepping into a world that wasn't meant for outsiders. It wasn't until they reached the grand staircase that they spotted him, Carter Rhoades, standing at the top of the stairs, surrounded by a group of powerful individuals. His commanding presence was hard to ignore, even in the midst of so many influential people. He wasn't just the leader of this gathering, he was the puppeteer who had orchestrated everything, controlling the very fabric of society without anyone knowing. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched Rhoades from afar. This was the man he had been tracking for months. The man who had built this empire of power and secrecy. The man who was at the heart of everything. But getting to him wouldn't be easy. "Stay close," Ethan whispered to Mark. "We're getting closer." They began to move toward the staircase, keeping their distance while still staying in range of their target. They knew the closer they got to Rhoades, the more dangerous it would become. Any sudden movement, any wrong word, could expose them. They had to be patient. "Ethan," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "We're not the only ones watching him." Ethan followed his gaze, and his stomach tightened. A man in a dark suit was standing by the railing, his eyes fixed on Rhoades with an intensity that didn't seem to fit in with the rest of the crowd. The man was trying to remain inconspicuous, but Ethan could sense the danger in him. He was no ordinary guest. "I think we're not the only ones interested in Rhoades," Ethan muttered. "Let's keep moving." They continued to press forward, but as they neared the base of the stairs, something unexpected happened. The man in the dark suit made a move, he stepped away from the railing and disappeared into a side corridor. Ethan's instincts kicked in. "Mark, follow him," he said, voice sharp with urgency. "I'll keep an eye on Rhoades." Mark nodded and moved without hesitation, slipping into the shadows as he followed the mysterious figure. Ethan stayed where he was, his eyes locked on Rhoades, but his mind racing. Who was that man? What was his connection to Rhoades and the Black Summit? The way he had watched the businessmen, it wasn't casual curiosity. It was surveillance. As he waited, Ethan's mind flashed to everything he had learned so far, the Black Summit, the corruption, the power, and the grip they held on the world. Rhoades wasn't just a figurehead, he was the architect. But there was something about this strange man that didn't sit right with Ethan. If he was here, it meant that something big was about to happen. Something that would change everything. Just as he was about to move closer to the staircase, Jake's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Ethan, we've got a problem. They know we're here." Ethan's heart sank. "What do you mean, they know?" "The security systems just picked up on a breach. They're locking down the estate. You need to get out now." Ethan's eyes widened. The whole estate was a trap. They had been set up from the beginning. "Mark!" Ethan hissed into the comms. "Get back here, now. We need to leave, or we're dead." But as Ethan turned to make his way to the exit, he saw something that froze him in his tracks. Rhoades had turned his gaze toward him. And this time, there was no mistake. Rhoades knew exactly who Ethan was. Panic surged through Ethan as his eyes met Rhoades's cold, calculating gaze. Time seemed to slow. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Rhoades knew. The game had changed, and every step from here on out was fraught with danger. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a split second, he considered bolting, running for the exit as fast as his legs could carry him. But there was no time. The moment he turned his back, Rhoades would have them. This wasn't a simple escape anymore. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. "Mark, where are you?" Ethan hissed into his earpiece, his voice tight with urgency. "Working on it," Mark responded, his tone calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. "I'm on my way back. Hold tight." Ethan couldn't afford to wait. He had to act. If he didn't, they were all dead. Without thinking, he took a step back and melded into the shadows, his movements as smooth and calculated as possible. He was aware of every breath, every noise. The mansion security had no doubt been alerted, and the people around them would soon realize something was wrong. But they had a moment, a window of time to get out before everything went sideways. "Stay low," Ethan muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the crowd. He needed to disappear in plain sight. He needed to blend in, and the best way to do that was to pretend like nothing was happening. He adjusted his suit and moved casually through the crowd, eyes never leaving the staircase where Rhoades had stood moments before. Rhoades was still watching him, but now the expression on his face wasn't just one of curiosity. It was one of calculation, as though he knew Ethan had figured something out. He knew Ethan was dangerous. As Ethan moved further into the crowd, he caught sight of Mark returning from the side corridor, his pace quick but measured. His expression was serious. Mark had seen something. "What did you find?" Ethan whispered as Mark slipped in beside him, looking like he belonged in the opulent sea of power and wealth. Mark's face was grim. "That guy in the dark suit? He's one of Rhoades's top enforcers. I didn't get close enough to hear much, but I saw him talking to someone in a back room. Someone high up, probably a member of the Black Summit." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What were they talking about?" "Can't say for sure," Mark replied, his voice low. But the way they were speaking, it was clear they were expecting something. "They're making plans." Ethan clenched his jaw. They didn't have time to investigate further. He needed to get out. Now. "We need to get to the exit," Ethan said, taking a step forward, trying to blend in. "Now. Let's go." They moved through the crowd, taking careful steps to avoid suspicion. But just as they reached the hallway that led to the main entrance, they were stopped. "Gentlemen," came a smooth voice behind them. "Where do you think you're going?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Rhoades's presence was unmistakable. He kept his back straight and turned slowly, facing the man who had orchestrated everything. Rhoades stood there, flanked by two of his enforcers, his piercing eyes locked on Ethan with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. I I was just making my way to the restroom, Ethan said, his voice calm but his mind racing. Rhoades raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Is that so? How about you join me for a conversation first? Before Ethan could respond, Rhoades' enforcers stepped forward, their gazes hard and unrelenting. Mark tensed beside him. We really don't have time for this, he muttered under his breath. Ethan's mind was a blur of possibilities. He needed to think fast. There was no way they were going to talk their way out of this. The guards were already on edge, and Rhoades was clearly not someone who enjoyed being challenged. We don't have time for games, Rhoades, Ethan said coolly, his voice steady despite the tension. We know about the Black Summit. We know what you're really doing here. Rhoades' expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed even more amused. You think you know what you're dealing with? You have no idea. The tension in the air thickened. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to act now. They were out of options. Now. Ethan shouted, and in the same instant, he shoved past the closest enforcer, sending him stumbling backward. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ethan's arm and yanked him forward, leading the way down the hall. The sound of footsteps echoing behind them sent a surge of adrenaline through Ethan's veins. Move it. Mark growled. They sprinted toward the back exit of the mansion, dodging guests and staff who were caught up in the confusion. Behind them, Rhoades' men were in hot pursuit, their footsteps getting louder by the second. It wouldn't be long before the entire estate was on high alert. Ethan's mind raced. Where was Maria? Where was Jake? As they neared the rear door, it burst open just as Maria and Jake appeared, running toward them. Maria was holding up a small device, and her eyes were wide with panic. They've locked down all exits, she yelled. We have to get out through the underground tunnel. Ethan barely had time to process her words before the unmistakable sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. The mansion was going into full lockdown mode. They had no time to lose. Lead the way, Ethan ordered. Without another word, Maria turned and dashed down a narrow corridor. The team followed close behind. They moved fast, feet pounding against the stone floors as they made their way deeper into the estate. Ethan could hear shouting in the distance, but he kept his focus forward, ignoring the chaos behind them. Finally, they reached a hidden door, its surface barely visible against the stone wall. Maria pulled a small panel on the side, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. She gestured for everyone to go through. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before following the team inside. They descended into the dark tunnel beneath the estate, the walls damp and cold. The air was thick with tension, but they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. As they moved through the tunnel, Jake's voice crackled through the comms. I found the escape route. It's a mile out. Keep moving. They pushed forward, the sounds of sirens growing distant, their only focus on getting out alive. But even as they ran, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much deeper conspiracy. The Black Summit had been a shadow, but now it was a threat they were fully aware of. Ethan's mind raced. The escape had been close, but this was far from over. The Black Summit had just become their enemy. And now, the real battle was about to begin. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the walls narrowing as the group descended deeper into the labyrinth beneath the Black Summit estate. The only light came from their flashlights, casting long, flickering shadows against the cold stone walls. Each step echoed in the silence, amplifying the tension that clung to them like a thick fog. Even in the midst of their escape, Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that they were being hunted, not just by Rhoades, but by a much larger, unseen force. Keep moving, Maria urged, her voice low but urgent. She was the one leading them through the dark maze, her sharp eyes scanning every corner for signs of danger. The exit's just ahead, but we need to stay ahead of them. They'll know where we're going soon. Ethan nodded but couldn't help the unease that twisted in his gut. They had barely escaped the estate. The sounds of the sirens had faded, but their enemies were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. "We're not just running from Rhoades anymore," Mark muttered, his face tight with frustration. "We're running from everything we've uncovered. The Black Summit isn't just some club of rich people. It's a network, an empire." "Exactly," Ethan said, his voice grim. "And Rhoades? He's at the top. But we don't know how deep this goes or how many people are involved." Jake, who had fallen silent since their escape, spoke up then. "We need to figure out how Rhoades is connected to everything, the summit, the tech companies, the global manipulation. He's pulling the strings. We've got a chance to expose him, but we have to understand the whole picture." Maria picked up the pace, leading them around a sharp corner. The tunnel ahead narrowed, and the atmosphere grew thicker, more suffocating. Ethan couldn't help but feel that they were headed straight into danger, but there was no choice. There was no turning back now. They had one goal: survive, and bring down the Black Summit. After what felt like hours, the group reached a small, dimly lit chamber at the end of the tunnel. The walls were smooth, and the air was surprisingly clean. It didn't look like a typical escape route, it looked more like a hidden bunker. Maria paused to listen, checking her surroundings, then stepped aside to allow the others in. "Looks like we've got a moment to breathe," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion but still sharp. "We need to regroup and plan our next move." Ethan exhaled deeply, running his hand through his hair. "All right. We've bought ourselves some time, but not much. Rhoades will be after us soon enough. Don't forget about the enforcers," Mark added, his expression dark. "They're dangerous. I saw them back at the estate. They're not just hired goons, they're military trained." "We'll be ready," Jake interjected, his voice steady. "But we need information. Fast." Maria nodded. "I've got something that might help. While we were escaping, I hacked into their network. It wasn't easy, but I managed to extract some files." She pulled out a small device from her bag and connected it to the laptop she had been carrying. The screen flickered to life, and several files appeared on the display. The group gathered around, eyes fixed on the screen. "Looks like Rhoades wasn't just running a summit," Maria said, pointing to a set of encrypted documents. "These are financial records, transaction logs, this is how he's moving money. But look here, these documents have connections to several major corporations. Big tech companies, energy firms, even government contractors." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This is it. This is the evidence we need to take him down. Maria continued to scroll through the files, her eyes narrowing as she found more sensitive documents. "This is bigger than we thought. Rhoades has been moving money through various shell companies, laundering it across continents. But there's more. There's a connection to a global surveillance project, a project that involves tracking and controlling not just data, but people." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of surveillance are we talking about?" "I don't know yet," Maria said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "But this goes far beyond corporate greed. This is about control. The kind of control that could change the entire world." Mark's voice was low, his tone heavy with realization. "They're building something, a system to monitor everything, everyone. All in the name of power. And Rhoades is the one at the top of it." Ethan's mind raced. The stakes were even higher than he had imagined. If we can expose this, if we can get these files to the right people, we can take him down for good. "But we can't just hand this over to anyone," Maria added, her face hardening. "If we go to the authorities, Rhoades will have eyes on them before we even get a chance to make a move. We need to take it to the press, to an independent journalist, someone who can get the story out without being silenced." Ethan nodded, weighing their options. "We need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that Rhoades will find us. Jake stepped forward, his expression grim. I'll reach out to someone I trust. But we'll need to cover our tracks. We can't let them know we're onto them. Ethan glanced at the group, feeling the weight of the moment. Their mission was about to shift from infiltration to exposure. They were no longer just survivors, they were fighters, and they had one goal now, to take down the Black Summit and destroy everything it stood for. All right, Ethan said, his voice firm. Let's do this. Let's bring Rhoades down. The team quickly made their preparations, gathering the files and ensuring that their path out of the tunnel was clear. They couldn't afford to linger any longer than necessary. Maria led them back toward the exit, her mind constantly working through potential threats. She'd been the one to get them this far, and now she had to make sure they made it out alive. The files they had collected were invaluable, but so was their escape route. They had to get to safety before they could do anything with the information they had. As they exited the tunnel and emerged into the night, the full weight of the situation hit Ethan. They weren't just up against a man, they were up against a system that spanned the globe. The Black Summit wasn't just a club. It was a force, an undercurrent of power running through every part of society, and they had just pulled back the curtain on its most dangerous secret. Rhoades would stop at nothing to protect what he had built. But Ethan was ready to fight back. This wasn't just about taking down one man, it was about exposing the heart of a corrupted empire. And now, there was no turning back. The night air was thick with tension as Ethan and his team made their way toward the safe house. The sense of urgency had never been more real. Their plan was simple, yet dangerous. They needed to get the stolen files into the hands of someone they could trust, someone who could expose the Black Summit to the world before Rhoades could silence them. Ethan's mind was still reeling from the discovery they had made in the underground bunker. The Black Summit wasn't just about money, it wasn't just about control, it was about a system designed to oversee every aspect of humanity, a network of surveillance and power that reached into every corner of the globe. If they didn't stop Rhoades now, they'd be living in a world where freedom was just an illusion. Are we ready? Maria's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. She looked every bit the hacker genius, but there was an edge of exhaustion in her eyes. This fight had taken its toll on everyone. Ethan glanced around at the group. Mark, normally the rock of the team, was clearly on edge, his hand instinctively brushing against the concealed weapon at his waist. Jake was unusually quiet, no doubt piecing together the next steps in his mind. They were all tired. But they were also determined. We don't have a choice, Ethan said firmly. We've come this far. If we don't make this work, everything we've done will be for nothing. Maria nodded, her fingers already working on her phone. I've contacted the journalist. She's ready. She's been following the summit for years, and she has the connections to get this out there, if we can get it to her. Jake's eyes narrowed as he scanned their surroundings. I still don't like it. They know we're alive. The second we make this move, they'll be all over us. They won't stop until they find us. They can try, Mark said darkly. But they won't catch us. We've come too far to let them win now. Ethan agreed, but the gnawing sense of danger in his gut wouldn't let up. They had no illusions about the risks. The Black Summit was far-reaching, and Rhoades wasn't the type of man to let anyone interfere with his operations. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. They arrived at the safe house, a nondescript building tucked away on the outskirts of town. It had been a quiet place for the last few days, but tonight, it felt like a battleground. As the team gathered around, Maria quickly set up her laptop, pulling up the files they had taken from the estate. The encrypted documents, transaction records, surveillance data, it was all there. Every bit of it tied Rhoades to a web of global corruption, far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Maria worked quickly, preparing the documents to send to the journalist. She was on edge, but she didn't let it show. She'd done this kind of thing 1,000 times, but there was something about this situation that made even her heart race. "Done," she said, her voice sharp as she hit send. The moment the files transferred, the team exhaled as one. "You did it," Ethan said, his voice a mix of relief and triumph. "Now, we wait." But the waiting was the hardest part. The plan had gone off without a hitch, but there was no telling what Rhoades' next move would be. They couldn't afford to be complacent. The clock was ticking. Jake pulled out his phone, his eyes scanning for any messages. "We'll have to lay low until we hear from her. She said it might take a few hours to get the story out, but once it's out, there's no going back. The world will know." Ethan's thoughts raced. It won't be enough just to have the information out there. Rhoades has too much power. We need to make sure the world sees him for who he really is, before he can spin it his way. Mark clenched his jaw. And we need to make sure we stay alive long enough for that to happen. Ethan's phone buzzed suddenly, cutting through the tension in the room. He picked it up quickly, his breath catching when he saw the caller ID. It was Maria's contact. "Put it on speaker," Maria said, her voice tight with anticipation. Ethan pressed the button, and the woman on the other end of the line came through clear and confident. "Ethan, it's Claire. I've seen the files. They're explosive. You were right to send them to me. I've already started reaching out to my sources. We'll get this to the press in a matter of hours, but I have to warn you, Rhoades is going to come after you. He's not going to take this lying down." Ethan's hand tightened on his phone. "We know. What's the next step?" Claire paused, the sound of typing in the background. "I'm working on getting a secure broadcast out. It'll take a little longer to set up, but once it's out, the world will know what he's been hiding. I'll make sure Rhoades can't control the narrative. This won't be easy for any of us, but it's the only way." "We're ready," Maria said, her voice low but resolute. "We'll do whatever it takes." "Good," Claire responded. "But you need to get out of there. Rhoades will be hunting you down. I've got a few safe houses set up, but you won't be safe for long if you stay in one place. Once the broadcast is live, things will get even messier." "Understood," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We'll keep moving." The call ended abruptly, and silence fell over the team once more. "All right," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "We've done our part. Now, it's time for the world to know the truth." But even as the words left his mouth, something inside him told him that this was only the beginning. The Black Summit wasn't going to give up without a fight. Rhoades wouldn't go down easily, and neither would the network that had supported him for so long. But for the first time, Ethan felt a sense of hope. They had the truth on their side, and that was more powerful than anything Rhoades could throw at them. As the team prepared to move to the next safe house, Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the dark streets. The city seemed so still, so unaware of the storm that was about to hit. But he knew that once the broadcast went live, everything would change. The game was on. And this time, they were going to win. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?